honor to Bishop. Saints, we would do well to emulate this man. I want to give honor to our associate pastors and to Brother Joey Austin, my PI instructor. So I give thanks to God. Saints, if you haven't done PI, you need to invest that little bit of money in your growth, in your soul. I think you would really enjoy it. Starting with Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. It says, "For this cause, or for this reason I, Paul, the prisoner of Jesus Christ, for the sake of you Gentiles." I'm reading, "If indeed you have heard of the stewardship of God's grace, which was given to me for you." I'm reading from the New American Standard because I like that word, stewardship. Paul, the steward of God's grace. The steward of God's grace. I want you all to be seated. I want you to think about this with me. Who could be a better messenger of grace than Paul? It's only because of Paul's grace that he became only because of God's grace did Paul become one of the greatest apostles of Jesus Christ and the author of 2/3 of the New Testament. He received and then imparted great insight into that subject of grace. He mentions grace 103 times in his letters. And you have to consider his life to understand that Paul taught from an extensive revelation and personal experience with God's grace. He originally went by his Hebrew name Saul. And if you get to know this man, Saul, you've become to understand that he was a religious terrorist. He really was. I mean, I'm sorry, we're reading about the religious terrorists of our day, and Paul was just as much in his time a religious terrorist as well. He did that all thinking that he was doing God a great favor, trying to eliminate the Jesus heretics. And Josephus, a historian of Paul's time, he wrote that during the reign of Herod Agrippa in Jerusalem, that seditions among sects of the priesthood turned into stone throwing, multiple occasions. And the scriptures tell of one incident where those of a certain synagogue disputed with Stephen, a disciple of Jesus Christ, and stoned him to death. And we read in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, "Saul was consenting unto his death, and at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem." Josephus also wrote of a person named Saulus, who during the time of Ananias the high priest, got permission from Ananias to use violence in the pursuit of his goals. Quoting Josephus, "Saulus did get together a multitude of wicked wretches and use violence with the people, and were ready to plunder those that were weaker than themselves. Our city Jerusalem was greatly disordered, and that things grew worse and worse among us." And although Josephus may not have been referring to the biblical Saul, the account is very descriptive of what could be said of Acts 8 and 3. He, Saul, began ravaging the church, entering house after house, and dragging off men and women. He would put them in prison. And Josephus records that the leader of the city at that time, Albinus, in an effort to please and appease the Jerusalem Jews, brought out all the prisoners he deemed worthy of death and had them put to death. And though this does not necessarily speak of the prisoners of Saul, it gives great example of what often took place. And Paul speaks of this of himself in Acts 26, 10 and 11. "Many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, and when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them, and I punished them oft in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme. And being exceedingly mad against them, I persecuted them even unto strange cities." In 1 Timothy 1 and 13 and 1 and 15, Paul says of himself, "I was before a blasphemer and a persecutor and injurious, and the chief of sinners." Can you imagine, saints, the utter heartbreak that Paul had to feel when he learns that the ones he had persecuted were not only the saints of the Most High God, but that very name that he so despised was the name of his God? Can you imagine that utter heartbreak? And you know, after that Damascus Road experience, Saul retreated to Arabia for 3 years. And I really believe that during that time, he took time to pray through his sorrow, the disgust that he had with himself, that he took that time, and it took him that time to really understand and comprehend and truly receive the grace that God offered him. I don't think that's a stretch to think about that. Put yourself in his shoes. What would you feel if you had done all the things that he had done to the saints and against the name of Jesus? And then God in his mercy and grace comes to you and reveals to you what you have done against him and the damage you have done to his church. I think it would take each and every one of us time to pray through that. So after his return from Arabia, he begins the apostleship and ministry of the gospel of God's grace. He drops his Hebrew name Saul, meaning asked for of God, and chose to use his Roman name Paul, meaning little. Not only did this allow the Gentiles to accept him more readily, but it gives us a strong indication of the change in Paul's assessment of himself. I want you to think about this messenger of grace. Where this man had no grace or mercy for anybody else, God extended to him grace. And he extended to us grace. We are all sinners saved only by grace. So Paul brings hope to all of us sinners everywhere, including modern-day religious terrorists, that we are not beyond the reach of God's grace. Saints, where sin abounded, grace did much more abound.